Johnny Silverhand is remembered as a rock star, a terrorist, and one of Night City's sharpest anti-corporate voices. But the key turn in his story is not his rise. It is how his life ended and how he kept existing after it. When Johnny's body was gone, what remained was an engram, a digital copy of his mind preserved by Arasaka technology. That detail changes everything that follows, because it turns Silverhand from a dead legend into a force in later events. To understand what happened to him, you have to follow both versions of Johnny, the man who lived, and the construct that survived him. Johnny Silverhand did not become dangerous because he was famous. He became famous because he was already dangerous. Before he was a voice in V's head or a digitized echo in the Relic, Johnny was a rocker boy, a veteran, and a man who decided the mega corporations running Night City were enemies, not just bad influences. That matters because Night City does not only produce celebrities, it produces symbols, and Johnny understood how to make himself one, as the frontman of Samurai. He used music to attack the corporate order, but the message was never just stage presence. He believed people were being controlled, manipulated, and reduced to assets by companies that shaped law, media, and violence at the same time. That belief pushed him far beyond the role of a loud performer. It put him near militant resistance, political violence, and operations that corporations and governments call terrorism when they are the ones being targeted. Johnny was not cautious, and he was not interested in moderation. He was confrontational, reckless, and willing to escalate. In a world where public outrage is often absorbed or sold back to the public, he kept trying to force a real clash. He wanted the corporate system to feel threatened, not just criticized. That is also why his legend is so divided. To some, he was a poseur who made rebellion look marketable. To others, he was one of the few people willing to act as if the system could be struck back. Both views can be true. Johnny lived where protest culture and real violence overlapped, and that made him a volatile symbol. He was not only singing about the machine, he was helping push people toward open conflict with it. His hatred of Arasaka is the clearest example of that. It was not casual resentment. It was personal, ideological, and sharpened by repeated clashes with the company's power. In Cyberpunk, Arasaka is not just another business to complain about. It is one of the pillars of the entire corporate order, with the reach to shape security, politics, and memory. Johnny understood that, and he acted like someone who believed the system had to be confronted directly. He was not just angry, he was trying to turn anger into an attack. By the time his name becomes truly infamous, he has already crossed from protest into armed rebellion. He is tied to the anti-corporate movement that targets Arasaka's grip on the city, and that makes him a public enemy in the eyes of the people who control the story. That matters in a setting like this. Being called a terrorist is not only about what you did, it is also about who gets to define violence in the first place. Johnny's actions made him impossible to ignore, but they also made him easy to frame. That is why his legacy splits so sharply. He is remembered as a threat because he really was one. He is also remembered as a hero by the people who saw Arasaka as the greater danger. The same acts that made him a target also made him a rallying point. He gave disaffected people a face for resistance, even if that face was angry, unstable, and hard to trust. In Night City, figures like that do not fade quietly. They become stories people repeat for their own reasons. What makes Johnny especially important is that he understood how power worked in Night City long before most people around him did. Corporations did not just own towers and private armies. They shaped public memory, decided which voices got amplified, and buried anyone who threatened the larger system. Johnny answered that with spectacle, rage, and escalation. He treated visibility as a battlefield. If the only way to be heard was to become impossible to ignore, he was willing to do exactly that. That approach built his following, but it also narrowed his future. Once Johnny committed himself to open opposition, there was no safe place left for him inside the world he was attacking. He could not simply return to being a performer and pretend the conflict was part of the act. The man and the persona became harder to separate. Every appearance, every statement, and every act of defiance added to the same legend until Johnny Silverhand was no longer just a musician. He was a warning, a rallying cry, and a problem the powerful wanted gone. So when people ask what happened to Johnny Silverhand, the answer starts here. He was shaped by a city that rewards spectacle, then pushed by that same city into direct confrontation. He chose to make himself a weapon against the corporations ruling his world, and that choice is what turns him from a famous musician into one of the defining figures in Cyberpunk. By the time the Arasaka Tower operation comes together, Johnny is no longer acting on anger alone. He has committed himself to a direct strike against Arasaka, one meant to hurt the company publicly and force a response. That is the important shift in his story. He is no longer chasing attention, and he is no longer treating this like a matter of image or ego. He has entered an operation built around damage, disruption, and sending a message that cannot be brushed aside. The assault on Arasaka Tower takes place in the wider conflict of the late Fourth Corporate War, and Johnny becomes part of a larger anti-Arasaka effort rather than a lone troublemaker. Different accounts disagree on how much of the mission he fully understood, or how clearly he remembered it later, but the basic outline is consistent. He is there as part of a team trying to hit Arasaka at its core. This is not a protest and not a symbolic stunt. It is a raid on one of the most powerful corporations in the world, carried out when the war is already so unstable that the strike feels desperate as much as daring. That matters because Johnny's role is often flattened into martyrdom. The truth is messier. He is one of the faces of the attack, but he is not the entire operation. Other people are doing much of the planning, and the mission is bigger than any one person's motives. Johnny still matters because he can draw attention, rally belief, and give the raid a name people remember. But once the fighting starts, legend does not protect him from Arasaka's response. The tower is heavily defended. The counterattack is organized, and Arasaka is built to absorb punishment and hit back harder. Adam Smasher is the clearest example of that. He is not just another guard or corporate soldier. He is one of Arasaka's most feared enforcers, a combat cyborg designed for overwhelming force and brutal efficiency. When Johnny reaches the point of direct confrontation with him, the imbalance is obvious. Johnny is defiant and willing to die for the cause, but Smasher is built to end fights. In the end, that is what happens. Johnny is cut down during the tower raid, and the version of events that survives in the public mind is simple. Johnny Silverhand dies at Arasaka Tower. That death is supposed to be the end of his human life. Instead, it becomes the point where his story stops following normal rules. Johnny is gone from the world of the living. He does not walk away, and he does not vanish into rumor. Arasaka recovers enough of him to preserve what remains as a digital engram. That is the transition that changes everything afterward. The man is dead, but the data remains. In Cyberpunk, that is not a small technical detail. It is the difference between a body that can be buried and a mind that can be copied, stored, and used later. Arasaka does not treat him like a corpse and move on. They keep him as an asset. The company he tried to destroy ends up preserving the pieces of him in a form it can control. From Arasaka's point of view, that recovery is useful because it turns an enemy into data they can manage on their terms. From Johnny's point of view, if any point of view remains, it is a worse fate than simple death. He does not get closure. He gets continuation without a body. So the night at Arasaka Tower is where Johnny Silverhand loses his body and becomes something far harder to erase. The raid ends with his apparent death, and that should have been the final word. Instead, it becomes the moment his life is reduced to memory, his identity is trapped in data, and the next chapter of his story begins in the most unnatural way possible. What Arasaka does next is what turns Johnny Silverhand from a dead rocker into a lasting problem. They do not just store a record of who he was. They preserve him as an engram, a digital copy of a person's mind, memory, and identity. In Cyberpunk, that is more than a backup. An engram can be stored, transferred, and in some cases placed into another body. Johnny is gone physically, but the part of him Arasaka captured is still active enough to be treated as property. That is why his survival matters to them. Johnny was not kept because the company respected him. He was kept because Arasaka has always been obsessed with control, and a digitized human consciousness is one of the clearest forms of control available. If a person can be copied and contained, then death becomes less final. Johnny's rebellion, his identity, and even his hatred can be boxed up and studied like any other asset. The man who spent his life fighting Arasaka ends up trapped inside Arasaka's own systems. The Relic project takes that even further. It is Arasaka's attempt to turn engrams into something usable, not just something stored. The chip is designed to hold an engram and, under the right conditions, let that stored personality take root in a living body. That makes it dangerous in two directions. It can preserve someone, but it can also replace them. The line between survival and overwrite is thin, and Arasaka knows it. Johnny's engram is not just sitting in a vault for sentimental reasons. It is part of the proof that this process works. That also explains why Johnny's engram matters so much later on. He is not preserved as a perfect continuation of himself. He is a digital copy made from what Arasaka recovered after his death, which means it is already incomplete in some way. Memories can be missing, Details can be distorted. What remains is a reconstruction, not a clean resurrection. Johnny comes back as stored information shaped by the limits of the technology that caught him, which makes him both less and more than the man who died at Arasaka Tower. For a long time, that might have been the end of it. A legendary rebel reduced to data inside a corporate system, locked away where almost no one will ever see him again, but the relic gives that Engram a route back into the living world. When the chip ends up in V, Johnny is no longer just preserved, he becomes active. The stored copy stops being a closed file and starts acting like an invading presence. That is the strange turn at the center of his fate. He does not return as Johnny Silverhand in the old sense. He returns as something Arasaka helped make possible and could not fully control. By the time the relic becomes part of V's life, Johnny's fate has already changed twice. First, he dies as a man, then he survives as data. And when the chip activates in the wrong body, that data starts fighting for space in the present tense. Johnny is still dead, but he is no longer gone. He exists as stored memory, corporate property, and a weapon hidden inside technology built to erase the line between one mind and another. The relic does not just let Arasaka keep dead people on file, it turns identity into something that can be moved, traded, and weaponized. And Johnny becomes one of the clearest examples of what that future looks like. There is a larger consequence too. Once an Engram can function inside living hardware, death stops being a hard endpoint for powerful institutions. It becomes a technical challenge. That is why Arasaka treats the relic as more than a single experiment. It fits into a broader attempt to control continuity itself, deciding who gets preserved, who gets restored, and who gets overwritten. Johnny's existence inside that system shows how far the company is willing to go. He is not simply remembered, he is repurposed. That is what makes his return so disturbing. Johnny does not come back with freedom attached to it. He comes back inside a corporate framework that defines his body, his memory, and his continued existence. Even his rage has been packaged. The man who tried to destroy Arasaka ends up becoming proof that their technology can reach past death and keep a person useful after the body is gone. V is where Johnny stops being history and becomes a present danger. The relic is no longer just holding his engram. Once it is damaged and loaded into the wrong body, it starts doing what Arasaka built it to do, rebuild the stored personality by using a living brain as the base. Johnny does not wake up in his own body. He is overlaid onto someone else's life. That makes the whole situation unequal from the start. V is the original host, and Johnny is the copy trying to persist. The chip begins repairing itself by rewriting neural tissue, and that process is fatal to the person already in the body. Johnny's return is really a replacement process. He is back, but only by sharing space with a life that the chip is slowly pushing aside. At first, Johnny mostly resists and argues. He talks, provokes, and forces himself into V's headspace because the relic keeps both of them in constant contact. He is not a ghost in the supernatural sense. He is an engram complex enough to act like a person, trapped in direct conversation with the host, that gives him something he never had in life, a front-row view of the future he helped create by accident. He sees how Arasaka evolved, how the relic turned identity into property, and how far the company is willing to go to control memory itself. The man who spent his life fighting the system is now trapped inside one of its worst inventions. That forced coexistence changes how Johnny sees V at first. He treats the body like territory he might lose or reclaim. Over time, though, it becomes impossible to reduce the situation to simple self-interest. V is not just a shell. V has a life, relationships, habits, and plans of their own. Johnny starts as an invader, but he is also trapped. Every choice he makes now affects the survival of the host, and that is the first real limit on his second existence. He cannot just be the anti-corporate icon he once was. He has to face the fact that someone else is paying for his comeback. That is what makes him more complicated than the old legend. Johnny Silverhand was remembered as loud, reckless, and impossible to contain. But the relic strips away the myth of independence. He is no longer acting alone. He is tied to another mind, another body, and a clock that is already running down. That makes him less like a triumphant return and more like a damaged remnant forced to adapt too late. He still carries the anger that defined him, but now it is filtered through the fact that he only survives because another person is being consumed. The chip also changes how his rebellion reads. Before, Johnny could be labeled a terrorist, a provocateur, or a martyr depending on who was telling the story. Inside V, those labels are no longer enough. He becomes proof that Arasaka's technology can cross the line between preservation and theft. He is not alive in the normal sense, but he is not just a recording either. He can think, react, remember, and change. That is what makes him dangerous again. Not because he came back unchanged, but because he came back as evidence that the line between person and data is exactly where Arasaka is willing to break the rules. It also forces Johnny to confront what he had become at the end of his first life. He did not simply vanish into legend and return cleanly. He had already been used, copied, and turned into a tool by the same system he hated. So the Johnny V meets is not the man from the loudest stories. He is a survival fragment shaped by corporate control, digital imprisonment, and a host body that was never meant to be his. Even his confidence is different now. It is sharper in some places and thinner in others, because it has to survive in conversation with someone who can push back. By the time V and Johnny are locked into this shared existence, his fate has changed into something stranger than survival. He is still dead, but he is no longer distant history. He is active, opinionated, and tied directly to someone else's future. What follows is not the full resurrection of Johnny Silverhand as he was. It is the slow realization that the man who died at Arasaka Tower is now inside another life, fighting to keep his own identity intact while helping decide whether V keeps theirs. What Johnny becomes after all of this is not a man brought back to life, but a personality forced to keep going under new rules. He does not return in his own body, and he does not get the clean ending he once wanted. What survives is his Engram, a constructed copy of his mind carrying his memories, his voice, his habits, and plenty of his worst impulses, along with the parts of him that still care about something larger than himself. That matters because Johnny is no longer just a figure from the past. He becomes a problem in the present, and one that cannot be reduced to a myth. For most of his life, Johnny defined himself through opposition. He hated Arasaka because he saw it as the sharpest example of corporate control taken to its limit. He also hated the wider system that allowed a company like that to become untouchable. That anger gave him direction, but it also narrowed him. Even before his death, Johnny had a habit of turning every conflict into a final stand. He wanted to strike hard, expose hypocrisy, and leave a mark. That made him memorable, but it also made him reckless. When he appears again inside V, those same traits are still there. The difference is that now they have to survive inside someone else's life. That shared existence forces Johnny to confront limits he never had to respect before. In his old life, he could burn bridges and walk away from the damage. As an Engram, he cannot just storm out. He has to deal with V's body, V's priorities, and consequences that do not stop when he wants them to. At first he is an intrusion, then a constant presence, and eventually he has to admit that V is not just a vessel. V is a person fighting to survive while carrying his dead memory like a wound. That is where Johnny's legacy starts to change. The old version of him, the rockaboy insurgent with a grenade in one hand and a slogan in the other, was easy to turn into a legend. The Engram version is harder to flatten. He is still arrogant, he is still angry. He still assumes he sees the world more clearly than most people around him, but he is also forced to understand the cost of that attitude more directly, because now that cost lands in the same body he depends on. Rebellion stops looking like a clean gesture. If he pushes too far, V pays for it. If he holds back, Arasaka's grip on both of them tightens. That makes him more than a symbol of anti-corporate rage. Johnny becomes a pressure point, something that can shape decisions, challenge assumptions, and drag old ideals into a crisis they were never built to survive. He is caught between two identities, the version of himself that still wants to tear the system down, and the version that has to notice how much damage gets left behind when destruction becomes the only answer. V's situation gives him no room to stay frozen in the pose he spent his life perfecting. By the time his story reaches the present, Johnny is no longer defined only by the moment he died at Arasaka Tower. That death still matters because it explains why he exists in this broken form at all. But the larger truth is that he has become a contradiction, a dead man who can still affect events, a rebel whose body is gone but whose anger remains, and a legend who now has to share a future with someone else. He is not restored. He is not redeemed. He is a powerful Engram, shaped by failure, memory, and the fact that his war with Arasaka never really ended. That is what happened to Johnny Silverhand. He died in Arasaka Tower, but death did not end his story. His body was gone, yet his Engram kept moving through the world, drawing him into conflicts he never expected and forcing him to confront the cost of his own legend. In the process, Johnny became more than a terrorist, a rocker, or a memory. He became a remnant that could still argue, still influence, and still wound the people around him. His fate is neither clean survival nor simple death. Johnny Silverhand ends as a man erased by Arasaka, preserved as a tool and carried forward as a warning. The man is gone. The legend remains. And in Cyberpunk, that may be the most dangerous kind of survival.